At 10 o'clock on a cold October morning in 1978, the front desk of New York's Chelsea Hotel received a call from room 100. The voice on the other end was barely coherent, slurred with drugs and desperation. "Someone is sick," the caller said. "Need help." The desk clerk recognized the voice immediately. It belonged to the 21-year-old British punk rocker who had checked in with his girlfriend 2 months earlier. They'd been nothing but trouble since they arrived. Screaming fights at all hours, drug dealers coming and going, complaints from other residents echoing down the hallways. But the Chelsea Hotel was used to trouble. For nearly a century, it had sheltered the broken and brilliant and the addicted and inspired. What happened next, however, would shock even the most hardened staff members who thought they'd seen everything. When hotel employees rushed upstairs and pushed open the door to room 100, they stepped into a scene that would become one of rock and roll's darkest and most enduring legends. The room was chaos. Clothes strewn everywhere. Drug paraphernalia on every surface. Blood soaked into the bedding, smeared across the floor. And on the bathroom floor, half hidden beneath the sink as if she'd crawled there trying to escape, lay the body of 20-year-old Nancy Laura Spungen. Her platinum blonde hair, once teased high in the punk fashion of the time, was now matted with dried blood. Her eyes stared at nothing. She wore only a black bra and black panties, both soaked crimson. A single stab wound had pierced her abdomen just below the navel, and she had bled to death slowly, alone, while her boyfriend lay unconscious in the next room, his system flooded with enough barbiturates to kill most people. This is the story of how a Victorian Gothic palace built on dreams of artistic utopia and communal living became the stage for one of music history's most infamous and unsolved tragedies. But to understand that terrible October morning, to understand how two young people from opposite sides of the Atlantic ended up in that blood-stained room, we need to go back to the very beginning. Back to 1883. Back to when the Chelsea Hotel was nothing more than an architect's audacious vision of a better, more equal world. In 1883, a French-American architect named Philip Gingembre Hubert stood on West 23rd Street in Manhattan's Chelsea neighborhood with an extraordinary and deeply idealistic vision. At that time in American history, apartment living was considered beneath respectable society. Proper families lived in townhouses or individual dwellings. Only the working class and recent immigrants lived stacked on top of each other in tenement buildings. The very idea of middle-class professionals sharing walls with their neighbors was scandalous. But Philip Hubert had different plans. Revolutionary plans that would challenge everything New York society believed about how people should live. Born in France and trained in both Paris and New York, Hubert had become fascinated by the writings of Charles Fourier, a French philosopher who believed that human beings could create perfect societies through cooperation rather than competition. Fourier imagined communities called phalansteries, where people of all social classes would live together, sharing resources, sharing labor, sharing the fruits of their collective efforts. Hubert wanted to bring that vision to America. He'd already tested his ideas with an earlier building called the Rembrandt on West 57th Street, and the experiment had worked beautifully. Artists, writers, and middle-class families lived side by side, proving that communal living could be civilized, even elegant. Now Hubert wanted to build something even more ambitious, something that would be impossible to ignore. He formed a partnership with James W. Person and Company and assembled his plans. The building would be called the Chelsea Associate Home Club, and it would be the tallest residential structure in all of New York City. Construction began in 1883, and from the very first brick, it was clear this would be something special. The Chelsea rose floor by floor throughout 1883 and into 1884, reaching an unprecedented 12 stories into the Manhattan sky. No residential building in the city had ever reached so high. People walking down 23rd Street stopped to stare at this Gothic tower rising above the neighborhood. The architectural style was Queen Anne Revival mixed with Victorian Gothic, giving the building an almost European feel, like a French chateau transplanted to Manhattan. The red brick facade was adorned with elaborate wrought iron balconies that looked like frozen lacework against the sky. Flower motifs decorated the ironwork, a deliberate choice by Hubert to bring beauty and nature to urban living. The building's footprint was massive, taking up most of the block between 23rd and 24th Streets. Inside, Hubert created something that had never existed before in America. The walls were built 3 feet thick, not just for structural support, but for soundproofing. Hubert knew that in a cooperative living situation, privacy and quiet were essential. Musicians could practice their instruments without disturbing writers in the next room. Families with crying babies wouldn't wake up the painters working late into the night. He installed an elevator, a relatively new technology, in 1883, making the upper floors just as accessible as the lower ones. He dedicated the entire top floor to artists' studios, with massive windows facing north, to provide the perfect quality of light that painters and photographers needed. He designed communal dining areas where residents could eat together if they chose, sharing both food and conversation. And perhaps most radical of all, he reserved apartments for the very laborers who were building the structure, proving that his vision of social equality wasn't just theoretical, but practical and immediate. The Chelsea Associate Home Club opened its doors in 1884, even before construction was fully complete, and it immediately became the talk of New York society. Newspapers wrote about it. Society ladies came to tour it. Critics debated whether such an experiment could possibly work. Could lawyers live next to plumbers? Could wealthy merchants share hallways with struggling artists? Hubert believed they could, and for 2 decades, he was proven right. For the first 2 decades of its existence, the Chelsea thrived exactly as Philip Hubert had imagined. It was a genuine cooperative where residents owned shares in the building and had a say in how it was run. Families raised children there. Artists created masterpieces in the northern light of the top-floor studios. Writers filled notebooks in quiet corners. Hubert's dream of a perfect community seemed to be working, proving that architecture and social philosophy could combine to create something better than either alone. But by 1905, reality intruded on the dream. Financial troubles that had nothing to do with the building's social success forced a fundamental change. The Chelsea Association couldn't maintain the cooperative model. Bills weren't being paid. Maintenance was falling behind. The building was sold and converted to a traditional hotel operation. Ownership changed hands, management changed, the rules changed, and yet, something essential about the Chelsea's spirit remained intact. Even as a commercial hotel, it continued to welcome artists, writers, dreamers, and outsiders who couldn't afford anywhere else in Manhattan. The thick walls that Hubert had built for his cooperative residents still stood, still provided privacy and soundproofing. The studios still flooded with light. And slowly, almost without anyone planning it, the Chelsea Hotel became a different kind of refuge. Not a socialist utopia, but a bohemian sanctuary. During the early 1900s, the Chelsea's reputation as an artist's haven grew organically. Mark Twain, the great American novelist and satirist, stayed there while working on manuscripts. His distinctive white suit and shock of white hair became familiar sights in the lobby. Playwright Eugene O'Neill, whose dark and psychological dramas would revolutionize American theater, lived there during some of his most productive years. The hotel began accumulating the kind of cultural cachet that money couldn't buy. It wasn't the fanciest hotel in New York. It wasn't the cleanest or the most modern, but it had something intangible that attracted creative souls from around the world. After the First World War ended, as America entered the Jazz Age and Prohibition era, the Chelsea adapted once again. Room prices dropped as the building aged and newer hotels opened across the city. But that decline in conventional status only made the Chelsea more attractive to artists living on the margins. Painters could afford long-term stays. Poets could write all night without complaints. Musicians could compose without worrying about disturbing neighbors behind those 3-foot-thick walls. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, when most hotels struggled to fill rooms, the Chelsea actually thrived. Its cheap rooms and tolerant atmosphere made it a haven for those hit hardest by economic collapse. Writers working on novels that might never be published. Actors waiting for auditions that might never come. Painters creating work for galleries that had closed. They all found shelter at the Chelsea. By the 1940s and 50s, the hotel had become legendary in certain circles. Literary magazines published stories about the characters who lived there. Jazz musicians knew it as a place where you could crash after a late-night gig. Abstract expressionist painters, the bold generation that would make New York the center of the art world, used Chelsea rooms as studios. And then, on November 5th, 1953, the Chelsea's darker reputation began to solidify. Dylan Thomas, the brilliant Welsh poet whose voice and verse had captivated audiences on both sides of the Atlantic, was staying in room 205. Thomas was only 39 years old, but decades of legendary drinking had ravaged his body. That night, he went to the White Horse Tavern in Greenwich Village, a favorite haunt of writers and bohemians. According to witnesses who were there, Thomas made a boast to anyone who would listen. "I've had 18 straight whiskeys," he claimed. "I think that's the record." Whether this boast was accurate or exaggerated, no one can say for certain. But what happened next was tragically real. Thomas made it back to the Chelsea, back to his room in the back of the building. Then he collapsed. His companion, a woman named Liz Reitel, called a doctor. Thomas was taken to St. Vincent's Hospital in Greenwich Village. He slipped into a coma and never woke up. 4 days later, on November 9th, 1953, Dylan Thomas died. The official cause was pneumonia aggravated by acute alcoholism and liver disease. But in the public imagination, the story became simpler and more dramatic. Dylan Thomas drank 18 whiskeys and died at the Chelsea Hotel. It wasn't quite accurate, but it was the kind of story that stuck. The Chelsea had claimed its first famous tragedy, and the mythology of the hotel as a place where genius and self-destruction met was born. Throughout the 1960s, as America transformed through civil rights movements, the Vietnam War, and the Counterculture revolution, the Chelsea Hotel transformed right along with it. The building became more than just a place to stay. It became a symbol of everything the establishment feared and everything the young generation embraced. Jackson Pollock, already famous for his abstract expressionist drip paintings, was a frequent and notorious visitor. The story of him vomiting in the private dining room during a luncheon became part of Chelsea lore. Peggy Guggenheim's sister, witnessing the incident, reportedly suggested they cut out the section of carpet and frame it, predicting that anything touched by Pollock would someday be worth millions. The suggestion was both a joke and deadly serious, capturing the strange intersection of high art and low behavior that the Chelsea represented. Bob Dylan, still unknown but burning with ambition, moved into a cramped room in the early 1960s. He wrote songs on an old typewriter, testing lyrics that would change American music forever. Years later, he would record an entire album, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, while living there, though he'd quickly move on to more comfortable accommodations once success arrived. Arthur Miller, one of America's greatest playwrights, retreated to the Chelsea after his painful and very public divorce from Marilyn Monroe. He needed somewhere quiet, somewhere the press wouldn't follow him, somewhere he could work through his grief by doing what he did best: writing. The Chelsea, with its thick walls and its unspoken rule that residents left each other alone, provided exactly that sanctuary. Beat Generation writer Jack Kerouac spent time there during his declining years, drinking heavily, working on manuscripts that would be published posthumously, watching the new generation of artists and rebels and wondering if he'd inspired them or if they'd simply moved past him. Leonard Cohen, the Canadian poet and songwriter, made the Chelsea his New York headquarters. He wrote songs there, entertained women there, and soaked in the bohemian atmosphere that perfectly matched his artistic sensibility. And then there were the painters, the photographers, the sculptors, the performance artists. People whose names are now forgotten but who, in the mid-1960s, were creating work that pushed boundaries and challenged conventions. The Chelsea gave them cheap rooms and asked no questions. Manager Stanley Bard, who had inherited the job from his father and would run the hotel for over 50 years, developed an unusual philosophy. If an artist couldn't pay rent, Bard would accept a painting or sculpture instead. The lobby and hallways gradually filled with artwork, turning the entire hotel into a kind of living museum. Some of the pieces would later be worth thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. Most weren't. But Bard didn't care about market value. He cared about the spirit of the place, about maintaining the Chelsea as a refuge for people who chose art over security, creativity over comfort, expression over respectability. In 1966, Andy Warhol brought his factory crew to the Chelsea and filmed a sprawling, experimental movie called Chelsea Girls. The film was revolutionary for its time, 3 hours long, using split-screen projections, no conventional narrative, just raw footage of the people living at and around the Chelsea. Drag queens and drug addicts and artists and runaways, all captured in their natural habitat. The movie shocked audiences and critics, but it also cemented the Chelsea's reputation as the epicenter of New York's underground culture. Janis Joplin, the bluesy rock singer whose voice could tear your heart out, stayed there frequently between tours. She drank Southern Comfort straight from the bottle and sang in the stairwells, her voice echoing through those thick walls. Jimi Hendrix, guitar god and psychedelic pioneer, used the Chelsea as a crash pad when he was in New York. His presence was quiet compared to some residents, but everyone knew when Hendrix was in the building. There was an energy that followed him, an electricity that seemed to charge the air. And then there was the affair between Janis Joplin and Leonard Cohen, a brief encounter in room 415 that Leonard would later immortalize in his song Chelsea Hotel No. 2. The song is beautiful and melancholy, filled with specific details, an unmistakable you that could only be Janis. Years later, Leonard would express regret about writing it, about being so specific that Janis couldn't be anonymous. But by then the song was famous, and the story was part of Chelsea mythology. Patti Smith arrived in New York in 1967, with nothing but a suitcase and a burning ambition to be a poet. She met photographer Robert Mapplethorpe almost immediately, and they became inseparable. Two broke artists supporting each other, pushing each other, sleeping in the same narrow bed in their tiny Chelsea room because they couldn't afford anything bigger. Patti worked in a bookstore. Robert took photographs. They created art together, lived on almost nothing, dreamed of the day when the world would recognize their talents. Years later, after both had become famous, after Robert had died of complications from AIDS, Patty wrote a memoir called Just Kids that captured what the Chelsea meant to young artists in that era. Not luxury or comfort, but freedom and possibility. By the early 1970s, the Chelsea's reputation had fully solidified. It was no longer just a cheap hotel that tolerated artists. It had become the place where artists went if they were serious about their work and willing to sacrifice conventional comforts. The building was aging badly. Paint peeled from the walls in long, curling strips. The carpets were stained and worn, showing threads in high-traffic areas. The plumbing was unreliable. The heating system worked when it felt like it. But none of that mattered to the residents, because they weren't there for amenities. They were there for the atmosphere, for the community, for the understanding that at the Chelsea, you could be yourself, no matter how strange or damaged or brilliant that self might be. Stanley Bard kept it running through sheer force of will and creative financial management. He let people stay for months without paying, accepting promises of future payment or artwork or simply their continued presence. Some thought he was a genius who understood the true value of art and artists. Others thought he was a terrible business person, letting the building fall apart. Both perspectives were probably correct. Nancy Laura Spungen was born on February 27, 1958, at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia. From the very beginning, her life was marked by struggle. The umbilical cord wrapped around her neck during delivery, causing severe cyanosis and oxygen deprivation. She survived, but her parents, Franklin and Deborah Spungen, soon realized their daughter was different. Nancy cried constantly. She threw violent tantrums that lasted for hours. At 3 months old, doctors prescribed liquid barbiturates, medication usually reserved for seizure patients. It didn't help. As Nancy grew older, the problems intensified. She was bright, her IQ tested in the superior range, but she couldn't make friends. She lashed out at her younger sister Susan with frightening aggression while showing tenderness toward her younger brother David. At age 11, after missing more than 2 weeks of school, she was expelled. Her parents, exhausted and desperate, sent her to special boarding schools. First Devereux Glen Home in Connecticut, then Devereux Manor in Pennsylvania. In January of 1972, Nancy ran away from Devereux Manor and attempted to end her own life by slitting her wrists with scissors. She was just 13 years old. At 15, psychiatrists diagnosed her with schizophrenia. They tried different medications, different therapies, but nothing seemed to reach the angry, troubled girl who looked at the world through suspicious eyes. Despite everything, Nancy graduated from high school in April of 1974. 2 weeks later, she was accepted to the University of Colorado at Boulder. At 16, she left home for college, hoping for a fresh start. It lasted 5 months. First, she was arrested for trying to buy marijuana from an undercover police officer. Then she was caught storing stolen property in her dorm room. The university expelled her, and her father had to travel to Boulder to negotiate a plea deal that resulted in Nancy being banished from the entire state of Colorado. She returned to Philadelphia briefly, then left for good at 17. New York City became her new home, and the music scene became her obsession. Nancy worked as a stripper in Times Square. She followed bands like Aerosmith, Bad Company, and the Ramones. She became known as a groupie, someone who attached herself to musicians, offering companionship, drugs, and whatever else they needed. She was loud, aggressive, and difficult, but she was also lonely, searching for something she could never quite name. In December of 1976, Nancy flew to London with a band called the Heartbreakers. Punk rock was exploding in England, and she wanted to be part of it. That's where her life changed forever. That's where she met a skinny, drug-addicted bassist with a stage name that would become infamous: Sid Vicious. John Simon Ritchie was born on May 10, 1957, in Lewisham, a working-class area of southeast London. His father left when he was young, and his mother, Anne Beverly, raised him alone. Anne was unconventional, to say the least. She sold marijuana to make ends meet. She introduced her son to drugs at an early age. By the time John was a teenager, he was already using speed, heroin, and anything else he could get his hands on. His mother didn't stop him. In many ways, she enabled him. John met Johnny Rotten, whose real name was John Lydon, at Hackney Technical College in 1973. They became friends, bonding over their shared love of rebellion and chaos. When Lydon joined a new band called the Sex Pistols, John started hanging around. He earned the nickname Sid after a hamster that had bitten Lydon. The hamster's name was Sid, and Lydon joked that his friend was just as vicious. The name stuck. Sid Vicious became his identity. In February of 1977, the Sex Pistols needed a new bass player. Their original bassist, Glenn Matlock, was out. The band's manager, Malcolm McLaren, wanted someone who embodied pure punk attitude. Sid couldn't really play bass. He often performed with his amplifier unplugged because his bandmates didn't want anyone to hear how bad he was. But what Sid lacked in talent, he made up for in image. He looked the part. Skinny, dangerous, with spiked hair and a padlocked chain around his neck. He snarled and spat and sneered. If Johnny Rotten was the voice of punk, Sid Vicious was the attitude. And in March of 1977, just weeks after joining the most notorious band in England, Sid met Nancy Spungen. She arrived in London on a cold night. Johnny Rotten had no interest in her advances, so she turned her attention to the new bassist. Sid and Nancy were immediately inseparable. Friends who knew them said it was like watching two people who had been waiting their whole lives to destroy each other. Nancy was aggressive and domineering. Sid was dependent and submissive. She introduced him to heroin, or perhaps she just fed an addiction that was already growing. Either way, within weeks, they were both using heavily. The other members of the Sex Pistols hated Nancy. They blamed her for Sid's worsening behavior. He missed rehearsals. He nodded off on stage. He became unreliable just as the band was reaching its peak. Manager Malcolm McLaren even tried to put Nancy on a plane back to New York, but she refused to leave. She and Sid moved in together, and their relationship became defined by screaming fights, public scenes, and a codependency that bordered on pathological. The tabloids started calling her nauseating Nancy. She seemed to thrive on the attention. For 19 months, from March of 1977 to October of 1978, Nancy Spungen and Sid Vicious were inseparable. They fought. They made up. They used drugs together. They hit each other. They clung to each other. And everyone who watched them agreed on one thing. This story would not end well. In January of 1978, the Sex Pistols embarked on a disastrous tour of the United States. The band was already falling apart. Johnny Rotten and Malcolm McLaren were at war over the band's direction. Sid's drug use had spiraled completely out of control. After just 7 shows, the tour collapsed. On January 14, 1978, the Sex Pistols played their final concert at Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco. At the end of the show, Johnny Rotten looked at the audience and asked, Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? The next day, he announced the band was splitting up. The Sex Pistols were over. Sid and Nancy were left adrift. Without the band, without structure, without purpose. They moved to New York City in August of 1978 and checked into the Chelsea Hotel, room 100. The front desk registered them as Mr. and Mrs. John Simon Ritchie, even though they weren't married. Sid paid for the room with money from his cover of the Frank Sinatra song My Way, which had become a hit in England. They settled into the small space and continued the only life they knew. Drugs, fighting, more drugs, isolation. The Chelsea Hotel had seen troubled souls before, but even by its standards, Sid and Nancy were extreme. Hotel residents complained about the screaming from room 100. People saw them stumbling through the halls, clearly high. Drug dealers came and went at all hours. Stanley Bard, the manager, tolerated it because that's what he did. He gave people space. But even Bard could see that something dark was brewing. On the night of October 11th, 1978, several people visited room 100. Witnesses later reported that Sid took enormous amounts of Tuinal, a powerful barbiturate. Some said he swallowed 30 tablets, enough to put most people into a coma. At around 2:30 in the morning, Nancy asked a man named Rockets Red Glare, who sometimes worked as Sid's bodyguard and sometimes sold them drugs, to get some Dilaudid, a strong opioid painkiller. What happened next remains one of rock and roll's greatest mysteries. At 7:30 that morning, guests in nearby rooms heard female moans coming from room 100. At 10 o'clock, Sid called the front desk. "Someone is sick," he said. "Need help." When staff arrived, they found Nancy's body on the bathroom floor, half naked, her head under the sink. Blood soaked her black bra and panties. A single stab wound in her lower abdomen had caused her to bleed to death. Next to her body, investigators found a Jaguar K11 hunting knife with a 5-inch blade. Nancy had bought it for Sid just the day before from a shop on 42nd Street. The knife was covered in blood. Sid was in the bedroom, barely conscious, his body still processing the massive amount of drugs he'd taken the night before. Police arrested Sid immediately and charged him with second-degree murder. During his initial interview, he allegedly confessed. "I did it because I'm a dirty dog," he reportedly told officers. But later, his story changed. He claimed he'd been asleep and couldn't remember anything. He said he woke up and found Nancy dead. He suggested that maybe she had fallen on the knife. He said he loved her and would never hurt her. His statements were all over the place, confused and contradictory. Was he lying? Was he protecting himself? Or had the drugs erased his memory so completely that he genuinely didn't know what happened? The investigation found no signs of forced entry. No fingerprints from outsiders on the knife. The room showed evidence of a struggle, blood on the bedding and floor, but Nancy had no defensive wounds. Nothing that suggested she'd fought off an attacker. To the New York Police Department, the case seemed straightforward. A drug-addled boyfriend, a dead girlfriend, a bloody knife. Sid Vicious was charged with murder and held at Rikers Island. But for those who knew the couple, nothing about that night made sense. Some people insisted Sid was innocent. His friend and former Sex Pistols manager Malcolm McLaren said Sid was capable of many self-destructive acts, but he didn't believe Sid could kill Nancy. She was his first love, McLaren argued, the only love of his life. Others pointed to the missing money. When police searched the room, they found drug paraphernalia and blood, but a substantial amount of cash that should have been there was gone. Sid had been earning royalties from his cover of My Way, and witnesses knew there had been a large bankroll in the room. Where did it go? This led to the most persistent alternative theory. that one of the drug dealers who visited that night had killed Nancy during a robbery. The man named Rocket's Red Glare became a suspect in some people's minds. He had delivered drugs to the couple that night. He'd been in the room. Author Phil Strongman, in his book about punk history, directly accused Red Glare of the murder. According to this theory, Red Glare returned to the room after Sid had passed out, saw Nancy barely conscious, tried to steal their money, and stabbed her when she confronted him. Red Glare denied this throughout his life until his death in 2001. He said another dealer, known only as Michael, had been there that evening and might have returned after he left. But no Michael was ever identified. No evidence linked anyone other than Sid to the crime. Another theory suggested a darker possibility, that Nancy and Sid had made a mutual agreement to end their lives together. That Nancy had taken the knife and harmed herself, expecting Sid to do the same. But Sid, too drugged to function, had simply passed out instead of following through. After Sid's death, his mother, Ann Beverly, claimed she found a note in his leather jacket. It supposedly read, "We had a death pact, and I have to keep my half of the bargain." Was this note real? Did Nancy want to die? Was this a failed attempt at a tragic romantic ending? We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that Sid never went to trial. After his arrest, he was released on bail for $50,000. His lawyers, funded partly by Virgin Records and reportedly helped by Mick Jagger, managed to secure his release. But Sid couldn't stay out of trouble. On December 9th, 1978, he got into a fight at a nightclub called Hurrah and attacked Todd Smith, the brother of punk musician Patti Smith, with a broken bottle. Sid was arrested again and sent back to Rikers Island, this time for 55 days. During that time, he was forced to detox. No drugs, no alcohol, just cold walls and withdrawal. On February 1st, 1979, Sid was released on bail again. That night, his new girlfriend, Michelle Robinson, threw a small party for him at her Greenwich Village apartment. Friends came over. There was food, there was conversation, and there was heroin. Sid had been clean for nearly 2 months. His tolerance was gone. His body was no longer used to the drug. When someone at the party gave him heroin, reportedly provided by his own mother, it was far purer than anything he'd used before. The medical examiner later estimated it was 80% pure. Sid injected it sometime after midnight. By morning, he was gone. Michelle Robinson and Ann Beverly found his body on February 2nd, 1979. Sid Vicious was 21 years old. With his death, the case against him in Nancy's murder was closed. The police had their suspect. He was dead. There would be no trial, no testimony, no chance for the truth to come out. Nancy Spungen's death became one of those mysteries that would haunt music history forever. Was Sid guilty? Did a drug dealer kill her? Did she take her own life in a desperate, drug-fueled moment? The only two people who really knew what happened in room 100 that night were both gone. Nancy was buried in her hometown of Philadelphia. Her Hebrew name, Hialeah Bat Ephraim Aharon, was inscribed on her gravestone. Her mother, Deborah Spungen, later wrote a memoir titled, "And I Don't Want to Live This Life," the title taken from a poem Sid had written about Nancy. The book explored Nancy's troubled childhood, her mental illness, and the impossible grief of losing a daughter to violence and addiction. Sid's ashes were scattered over Nancy's grave, according to his wishes. In death, they remained together. In the years after the tragedy, Room 100 at the Chelsea Hotel became part of the building's dark mythology. Tour guides whispered about it. Music fans made pilgrimages, The hotel itself kept operating, still run by Stanley Bard, still housing artists and musicians and writers who couldn't afford anywhere else. Andy Warhol wrote in his diary that the Chelsea let anybody in and that the place was dangerous, like somebody was killed there once a week. It wasn't quite that bad, but the reputation stuck. The Chelsea was beautiful and decaying, elegant and dangerous, inspiring and tragic. In 1986, director Alex Cox released a film called Sid and Nancy, starring Gary Oldman and Chloe Webb. The movie romanticized their relationship while also showing its ugliness. Critics praised the performances, especially Webb's portrayal of Nancy as more than just a villain or victim. She was complicated, troubled, human. After researching the role, Gary Oldman said he became convinced that Sid didn't murder Nancy. He believed the truth was more complex than the police report suggested. But belief isn't proof, and proof was something the world would never get. The Chelsea Hotel continued its slow decline through the 1980s and 90s. The building aged, repairs were neglected, but artists kept coming. The rooms were cheap. The atmosphere was one of a kind. Ethan Hawke lived there during his divorce. Rufus Wainwright wrote his second album there, gathering material and boyfriends and late-night stories. The hotel appeared in countless songs, books, and films. It became more than a building. It became a symbol of creativity, of struggle, of the thin line between genius and destruction. In 2007, Stanley Bard was finally forced out of his management role after running the hotel for over 50 years. The new owners wanted to renovate. They wanted to turn the Chelsea into something profitable again. But long-term residents fought back. Lawsuits followed. The city investigated claims of tenant harassment. Construction started, then stopped, then started again. The hotel closed to transient guests in 2011. For 11 years, it sat in a strange limbo. Some permanent residents still lived there, their rent-stabilized apartments scattered among empty, half-renovated rooms. The iconic neon sign stayed lit, but the doors were mostly closed. Finally, in March of 2022, the Chelsea Hotel reopened. The renovation had cost over $30 million and taken more than a decade. The new Chelsea was luxurious. Marble bathrooms, custom furnishings, rooms starting at $600 a night. The famous wrought iron staircase remained. Many of the paintings gifted by former residents still hung on the walls. El Quijote, the Spanish restaurant that had been there since the 1930s, reopened with updated decor. A French bistro called Café Chelsea opened in 2023. A rooftop spa offered treatments in rooms with original vaulted brick ceilings. The Chelsea was beautiful again. But some people wondered if it had lost its soul. Could a hotel charging premium prices still be a haven for broke artists? Could luxury coexist with the messy, chaotic creativity that once defined the place? About 40 permanent residents remain, their apartments marked with letters instead of numbers, randomly interspersed among the hotel rooms. They are the last links to the old Chelsea. When they're gone, what will remain? Just stories. Just ghosts. Just the legend of what once was. Today, when people visit the Chelsea Hotel, they walk through halls that have seen more history than most museums. They stand in the lobby where Patti Smith first met Robert Mapplethorpe. They look at the staircase where Jackson Pollock stumbled drunk. They pass by the doors where Bob Dylan wrote Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands. And they pause at room 100. The room where Nancy Spungen died, the room where punk rock's most infamous love story reached its bloody conclusion. The new hotel operators don't advertise which rooms were connected to which famous residents. They don't put plaques on the doors. But everyone knows. A quick internet search will tell you. Room 100 is available to rent, if you want it. If you can afford it. If you don't mind sleeping where a 20-year-old woman bled to death on the bathroom floor. The story of Nancy Spungen and Sid Vicious has become a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of addiction, codependency, and the myth that love can save someone who's drowning. Nancy and Sid didn't save each other. They pulled each other under. Their relationship was toxic from the start, fueled by drugs and mental illness, and a desperate need to belong to someone, anyone, even if it meant destruction. But there's another side to the story. Two young people, both deeply damaged, found each other in a world that didn't want them. Nancy, with her childhood trauma and her diagnosis and her inability to fit in anywhere, finally found someone who didn't push her away. Sid, with his absent father and his addict mother and his lack of any real identity beyond his stage name, found someone who needed him. For 19 months, they had each other. It was ugly and violent and wrong in so many ways, but it was theirs. Does that excuse the violence? No. Does it explain the tragedy? Maybe. The truth is, we'll never fully understand what happened between them. We'll never know who killed Nancy Spungen. We'll never know if Sid was guilty, innocent, or something in between. The case is closed. The files are sealed. The only witnesses are dead. What we're left with is a building, the Chelsea Hotel, a Victorian Gothic palace that was supposed to be a utopia for artists. That was supposed to prove that people from different backgrounds could live together in harmony, creating beauty out of community. Instead, it became famous for the tragedies that unfolded within its walls. Dylan Thomas drinking himself into oblivion. Sid and Nancy destroying each other. Countless other stories of people who came to the Chelsea looking for inspiration and found only their own demons. Yet somehow, despite everything, the Chelsea Hotel endures. It has survived bankruptcy, neglect, scandal, renovation, and gentrification. It has outlived almost everyone who made it famous, and it continues to fascinate us because it represents something fundamental about art and ambition and the human condition. That creativity often comes from darkness, that beauty and decay can exist side by side, that the line between genius and madness is thinner than we like to admit. When you stand on West 23rd Street today and look up at those red brick walls and wrought iron balconies, you're looking at more than a hotel. You're looking at a monument, to dreams, to failure, to the artists who lived there and the ones who died there, to Nancy Spungen, who wanted to belong so badly that she followed a bass player to London and lost herself in a relationship that everyone knew was doomed. To Sid Vicious, who wanted to be somebody so badly that he became a caricature, a punk rock poster boy whose image outlived any music he ever made. To Dylan Thomas and Patti Smith and Bob Dylan and Arthur Miller and every other soul who walked through those doors looking for a place to create, to hide, to self-destruct, or to be reborn. The Chelsea Hotel is still standing. Room 100 is still there. The mystery remains unsolved. And somewhere in the walls of that building, in the worn marble stairs and the soundproof rooms and the artist studios filled with northern light, the ghosts of the past still linger, whispering their stories to anyone willing to listen, reminding us that behind every legend is a human being. Behind every tragedy is a life unlived, and sometimes the most beautiful places hold the darkest secrets.